Hello, and welcome to Price Points. Today's topic is incredibly important, but also one that comes with a great deal of stigma and uncertainty: mental health. The Centers for Disease Control defines mental health as our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. Our mental health affects how we think, feel, and act, and also helps determine how we handle stress, relate to others, and make healthy choices. Newport News is in the midst of an intensive community safety initiative. The first part of our work included a survey to identify people's concerns. Over 5,000 people responded, and the number one concern was mental health. Over 44% of our respondents reported they sometimes or often feel depressed or anxious. Rates are even higher for those under 30 years of age. We know mental health issues have grown due to the pandemic, but there still tends to be a significant stigma attached to anything related to mental health. This is why it's imperative that we acknowledge good mental health efforts and work to overcome the barriers that have been put up that keep us from addressing mental health in a positive and a productive way. I've gathered a diverse group today to discuss this topic. Joining me is Newport News Sheriff Gabe Morgan, Newport News Police Chief Steve Drew, Lieutenant Andre Dorsey with the Newport News Fire Department, Quincy White, Executive Director of the Four Oaks Day Services and Training Center, and Daphne Cunningham, Deputy Executive Director of the Hampton Newport News Community Services Board. Daphne, I shared how the CDC defines the mental health. Does the CSB take the same approach, and how do they support those with mental health needs?
So good morning, and thank you, Mayor. Yes, the Community Services Board defines mental illness the same as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And again, to reiterate, that includes the person's overall mental, emotional, and social well-being. And where we fit into that space within this community is that we are the entryway into the publicly funded behavioral health care system. And we seek to provide services that address mental illness from prevention through recovery, and to provide self-determination to folks who are affected by mental illness. And so our services really run the gamut. Hopefully I'll get to talk some more about those as we move through this morning. But one of the things that we try to do is educate the community to understand that mental illness is common, more common than people might think, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. We often use the example, or the analogy I should say, of a person's physical health. If a person is physically ill, they seek to be diagnosed, treated, apply that treatment, and hopefully, if that treatment is applied correctly and consistently, they will live productive and lives that they choose to live. And so we think that if people could embrace that same concept when it comes to mental health, we'll see people to start to embrace that more and see those same type of differences that we see when people apply treatment to physical health.
Well, this question is for everyone, so let's just go around. Are we seeing increased numbers of people who need mental health help in all the departments? Let's start with you.
Yes. Also, thank you for inviting me this morning, Mayor Price. We definitely are. The training that came along with the initiation of the CARE program, fortunately, I have to monitor 2 radios. So on the police side, I have to monitor what they respond to, as well as what we respond to. And they respond to 90% of what the average citizen in the city of Newport News has no idea of going on, as far as concerning a mental health or behavioral health call.
Okay. Chief?
Yes, thank you for the invite. Let me sit in this great panel. The Lieutenant's exactly right. We see calls continuing to go up just about every year, and certainly since the pandemic, we've seen a significant increase in mental illness calls. Some to the same locations or same individuals over and over again, and then others to newer individuals. And your opening was right on. We're seeing more and more with younger people, high school students and people in their 20s that are having this, whether it's issues or breakdowns, but it's those services those calls that we go to, getting them the right services, knowing where to go, our partnerships with our boards. But it also, we take a hard look at what the officers see when they respond to those type calls and making sure that they're okay, and trying to battle through some of those stigmas that historically have been there. But we're definitely seeing an increase in some of the violence that goes along with that, whether it's medication or whether it's going through some type of crisis. But it is very concerning at the rate of calls that we receive.
Okay. Sheriff?
Well, I will tell you that yes, there is more calls for services associated with mental health. There are more emergency custody orders, and that's where we take someone off the street against their will because they're either a danger to themselves or the public, and force them into treatment. And those calls have increased, and like you've heard earlier, they're getting younger. We've transported someone as young as 9, which is heartbreaking because the parents bring them to the emergency room. They're struggling, and there is no easy fix for them. And to take a young child and force them into treatment, it's really heartbreaking. The other place that I've seen an increase is in geriatric. I will tell you right now, we've had in excess of 15 people over the age of 60 who has been arrested, jailed, and for the most part, they're homeless. They have SMI, serious mental illness, and if not for that illness, they probably would not have been in jail. So, you know, it's young, it's the older generation, and everything in between. There is just so much more happening out here today.
Quint?
So from my end, we're seeing an increase of individuals that are new to becoming homeless. Through the pandemic, evictions increasing. So we're seeing folks affected by trauma and dealing with those crises. So we're seeing an increase of that as folks become, as the homeless population increases with the evictions increasing. So we've seen quite a bit of that.
Okay, Chief, what role does mental health play in crime?
So a lot of the calls we go on where we deal with mental illness or mental health, first when an officer responds is trying to identify what that crisis is, where are they at? But we see that individuals, whether it's a domestic situation, whether it's a situation like Quincy just talked about, that they've been evicted or that they're homeless, that they're struggling, that they've lost their job, whether it's maybe past with the military that's brought on, issues with the pandemic. We saw a lot of frustrations with people being out of work and not knowing where their next paycheck came from, and just those issues with society. So sometimes if you interject a firearm or there's firearms inside a house, it can create a standoff or a SWAT type mission. We've had several of those where those calls have just, because there's been some type of breakdown or some type of crisis that an individual's going to, that we have to remove neighbors and then deal with that individual in the best way that we can with some of the officers that have some more training than others. But it's forced us to change the way we train, the way we prepare officers to go on the street, making sure that their mental illness is right, that they know how to talk to people, try to de-escalate those situations. We get a lot of insight from CSB board and strategies and ways, but it can create issues with just a fight. We see some of the shootings that have been across the country, and when I read those after action reports, there's issues with mental illness, whether medication is off or frustration against a particular group or establishment, and how those are all things that we look at and we try to stay up on, not just here in Newport News, but really across the country, reading those after actions reports. But it can lead, when you inject firearms or behaviors, that's not good chemistry, and it can be very concerning, not only to the officers responding, the individual going through that crisis, their loved ones, but in the community at large.
Okay. And Sheriff, how does your office support inmates with mental health?
Well, it's a multi-pronged approach. The first is everyone that's booked goes through an assessment, initial assessment. And it's either a mental health provider is doing the assessment or one of the booking deputies that's been trained to do the initial assessment. Depending on where they score, they then, if they score high, we refer them to an actual licensed practitioner who will then make another assessment and determine what level of care they need, and then they're then placed into that level of care. So they're initially assessed, and then they're assessed further by a mental health practitioner, and then placed into the type of services that they require. I will tell you right now that we have probably a little over 33% of inmates with SMI. The ability to keep them stabilized.
That's 1/3 of your population.
1/3 of the population, yes.
Wow.
It's difficult, but it's something that needs to happen, because if they're not provided with the proper care, what ends up happening is they spiral, and that becomes a worse situation for them and those that are incarcerated as well. The biggest problem we have sometimes is getting them to the next tier of service, and that is the mental health hospitals. Available beds. We've had in this state a problem with getting available beds. We have a lack of resources at the state level. I believe there's 5 mental health hospitals. We transport to all 5 of them all over the state. There are times when we have to take someone 4 hours away just to get them a bed.
And usually two people have to go on that
Exactly.
transport.
So that's 2 people that have to go with them, pulling resources away from here and servicing the community as a whole. So it's a strain in a number of different ways, but we know we have to provide those services, because if not, you can just read what happens nationally, and luckily we have not had those experiences. The outcomes are disastrous normally if you don't treat them accordingly.
Okay. Lieutenant, talk to us about the care unit. How and why was that developed?
So the care unit was an initiative that was started July 19th of last year. I'll never forget that number. So we're coming up on our 1-year anniversary. So it was an initiative that was introduced to the committee, my former assistant chief Hudgens, and he brought it to the table and said, just what this panel is discussing now, this area is beginning to see more and more calls and issues with mental and behavioral health. So we need to have a way from the public service standpoint that we can address that safely and responsibly and make sure that these individuals get the assistance and the resources that they need. So in doing all of that, committee was formed, and from that committee was the initiation of the CARE, and that's an acronym for Community Assistance and Response. And what that does is it teams up 2 individuals. One is a paramedic and the other one is a crisis counselor. And they go out to the calls along with police, and we address whatever issue the individual may be having. They transport individuals on a voluntary basis. They deal with the ECOs and the TDOs that Sheriff Morgan mentioned. And if there isn't a transport, then the team provides resources to the individuals, because obviously everyone that they go out and see may not be transported. Sometimes there's that breakdown that Chief Drew mentioned earlier, where I am having a breakdown, but I don't need to seek professional help. I'm just going through something right now, but I need some resources. Do you have something to provide to me? And they do. They offer information on substance abuse, domestic abuse, other mental health. It may be something that may be diagnosed, and they may reach out to our CSB partners and say, hey, we have an individual here that they may need to meet up with a counselor. Can you connect them with a counselor? And we get in touch with them to do that. So it's been a very, very productive program.
So how many units do we have now?
We currently have 2. This fiscal year, we put in for another one, so that'll make 3 on the road. What the fire department is also doing is we're looking and working with police department and with CSB to get more of our members trained through CIT, crisis intervention training. And the unfortunate part is for the amount of individuals that we have in our city, those 3 units can't cover everybody in our city. So Chief Drew has dedicated and make sure that his members are CIT trained. We want to make sure that we do the same thing. So in those days or those times where those units are on another call, if we have to respond, officers or fire department members, to a call, that those officers and members are trained so that they can be aware of what's going on with this individual, and it's not just your normal call. And you know, we're seeing an increase in so much of this that's going on, not across the country, but throughout the city as well.
Okay. So what other services are available for our community through CSB?
Okay, so we have a wide array of services, and I'll just try to touch on a few of those because we have so many. One of the services that we provide that is critical right now is what we call rapid access, where an individual is experiencing what they know to be, a mental health issue, and they're able to walk in, and on that day they can receive an assessment for services, and those services will be recommended. If therapy services are recommended, then we are able to provide those appointments within the first 10 days if we have, the staffing to do so. We also have a program for individuals who have a history of mental illness, who've been hospitalized, and that program is what we call our psychosocial rehab program. And what happens is the person comes to our center from on Monday through Friday, and so they're able to receive some socialization services there. They're able to go out and do some work in the community to help reestablish their connection to the community. We also, within our outpatient services, we have an adult clinic as well as a children's clinic. On our adult side, we served about 5,000 individuals, and that's with providing medication management as well as providing therapy. And then on our children's side, we served about 1,000 children, providing therapy as well as medication management. Over the course of the 2021 fiscal year, we actually served about 11,000. We served about 11,000 people in this community. And so as much as we hear about what's going on in the community, we also know that were we not able to provide those services, we would see much more instability. We have one program called the Assertive Community Treatment Program that goes out into the community and works with individuals who were formerly hospitalized on a daily basis to make sure that they receive their medications, and that again helps them to maintain their stability. We have a peer recovery support component within our agency. We have several peer recovery specialists that work throughout various programs. One of the programs that we run is a warm line, and what that means is a person sees that they need assistance. They might not be at the crisis level yet, but they're able to call and talk to someone with lived experience that can kind of guide them through that process and also help link them to services. Case managers who help to link folks to community resources and services and check on them periodically to make sure that they're okay. So we do, again, we have a wide array of services for folks with mental illness. We certainly work with all of the folks around this table to help meet the needs of the community and kind of gauge what's going on as well. Keeping those lines of communications open is obviously critical. When we know as a community what's going on, we can work together to solve that, because I might have resources that the sheriff might not have and vice versa. So it's critical that we maintain that communication so that we can reach people in a holistic manner. We also, we agree, we have seen an influx of people with anxiety, depression. The area that we've probably seen that most is probably our youth. I can't say that we dug into that data at the CSB, but we know that the National Alliance for Mental Illness does state that youth and young adults are the ones who were most impacted by the pandemic. And that stands to reason because so much of their life was disrupted. You have people who were connected to a football team or a basketball team, that camaraderie, that ability to be a standout, those things were taken away. And the same with youth who just needed that interaction. Their entire way of learning was disrupted. And then, speaking about family members being stressed. They're at home all day with their children, and they're worried about how to homeschool. They're worried about how am I going to pay my bills? When is my job going to resurface? So all of these things have played into what we've seen with the changes in the pandemic. So, we've certainly tried to be at the forefront of that, recognize those needs, and work collaboratively with our community partners to not only continue the services that we provide, but look for new opportunities to develop services that will help meet the needs of the community.
That's great. Quincy, tell us about Mental Health Mondays and why did you start that?
Sure. So as we spoke about earlier today, we saw an influx of folks that were facing different crises. So we thought it would be best to have different mental health providers come to one place. At Four Oaks, we believe having all the resources at your fingertips will allow folks to connect with services quickly. There really are no excuses at that point. So we wanted to make sure we brought a lot of different mental health providers every Monday at Four Oaks, led by our mental health specialists, to connect and build that trust with some of our homeless citizens. As we know, there is a complicated correlation between homelessness and mental health. And we want to make sure that the services that our folks need are, right there at their fingertips. So every Monday, if you come to Four Oaks, you'll see a slew of different mental health providers to assist our homeless citizens.
Okay. Well, this is a question for everyone, and whoever wants to answer it. What could we do better as a community to help with mental health from each department? Is there something more that is needed, something you feel that we do well, or something we could do better?
I'll tell you, I think that CARES unit, I think the city is very progressive. There's not a lot of cities that have that alternate response to not having someone in uniform show up as being that first responder. So I think to experience, hear the success that's having, to expand that. I think we've got some things in the work now to increase more bed space here in the Hampton Roads area, the Tidewater area on the peninsula. That's one of the biggest issues when we're taking officers off the street to sit with individual patients that are in custody orders or temporary orders at the hospital before they are released back. So as we look to maybe expand the police department, that would be a unit that I would like to put together to have committed to the hospital. So officers aren't having to come off the street. They can do a good soft handoff to officers who are assigned at the hospital to look after those that are in that mental crisis or being evaluated. So those are a couple of things that I look at. Continue training on how officers and all of us respond, to have that initial conversation to try to prevent negative confrontations, right? That we know how to de-escalate, recognize someone in crisis, and get them some of the opportunities and needs. So those are three of the things that I would like to see us expand on as we move in, as we go forward from here.
I'd like to just add a couple things to that. When we talk about the hospital and the handoff, that is so critical. What we end up seeing a lot of times is that folks that are in crises go to a hospital and they're sitting there for hours, sometimes 24, 42, 72 hours, sometimes trying to find a bed. And I just want to applaud the city for making the investment to try to help out with this situation, because what we are going to experience hopefully very soon is we are going to have a test site for emergency mental health department, which is, there are no others in the state. So the process is that someone goes to the hospital, we contact the CSB, they come, they find them a bed. In the meantime, before they can go to a mental health hospital, they have to get clearance, medical clearance. Mm-hmm. And that medical clearance is to say they don't have anything else going on with them medically, because the mental health institutions can't handle those situations. They're not equipped to deal with that. So with a psychiatric or a psychiatric emergency facility, they can go there, get the start treatment right away, because when they're at the regular hospital, they're not getting treated. They're there, and they're further decomposing. And so to treat that in an emergency mental health facility is big. Also, if there are beds, additional beds, there's some place for them to go. So that's number one. If that proves out, that is a model that we can replicate throughout the state and hopefully ease some of the crises and the travel and resources that's associated with it. The second thing is CIT. We have to be able to train more CIT.
What's CIT? Just make sure people understand.
Crisis intervention training.
Okay.
And that's where officers, first responders are trained for 40 hours on how to, one, identify and deal with someone who's having mental issues. And that is so important. And the goal is for every first responder to be trained. But you think about that. That's a resource that we have to put into it. That's 40 hours. That's a whole week's worth of taking someone out of service, putting them in training, and then the resources to put that training on. We need mental health professionals. We need lawyers, legal personnel, all that to make that happen. So more resources need to go in so that we can train more people. And then the last thing is we have to begin to have more conversations with each other. I started this geriatric intensive case management where the CSB and the Four Oaks and the courts. I'll give you an example. We had, I'll just call her Miss L. She's over 80 years of age. She ended up in jail 5 times for violating a protective order. Well, think about that. Why would an 80-year-old go to jail 5 times for a protective order? Well, she was having mental issues. Well, if there's a protective order, the police hands are somewhat tied because they get called, someone's violating the order, we have to protect the public, so she gets arrested. She comes to jail, she bonds out, she goes back, same thing happened again. Why? She's having, and it's because she was living next door to the person that the protective order was. Well, all of a sudden, I'm like, something's wrong here. So we got everybody together to figure out, well, what can we do? So we actually got her moved to another complex. But before that, we had her deemed that she could not be, restored mentally. So that was the first thing, to show that mentally there's no intent for her to do what she's doing. Right. So that's the kind of thing that happens when we get around the table and start talking about these individual cases, because what we're finding is Four Oaks is giving resources, the fire department's responding, the police is responding, they're being locked up in the jails, the court is being impacted, and when you count up all those resources, all of a sudden you go, oh, and I forgot the CSB, right? So when you count all, and human services, adult protective service, when you count up all those resources, the amount that we spend on that one individual, if we get around the table and say, okay, this is a case that we all need to sit around the table and figure out how to solve, we're gonna, 1, have better outcomes, and number 2, we're gonna save money and be able to put those resources towards others.
Well, it sounds like you all are collaborative in treatment and trying to solve the problem. But what can we as a community do to remove this stigma about mental health? What is it we can do to help people to understand that it's just like you talked about, it's a physical problem and people have them? What can we do?
Well, I think having, maybe fairs or, opportunities for people to come out and gather information, and conversations like this, being able to get those out where people can see those conversations. One of the upsides, I guess, if we have those of social media, is that we see celebrities who talk about mental illness and mental health issues now. And so sometimes people can relate to that, and they can see that just because I have this diagnosis does not mean that I'm going to be unsuccessful. It does not mean that something is wrong with me that I can't overcome, and it's not something that I have to be ashamed of. So I think as a community, to have events that we can respond to some of those concerns that the citizens reported in their survey, and they can see that there are mental health resources out there. Sometimes people just don't know. We struggle as a CSB for people to even understand what that means. Even though we serve these 11,000 folks in the community, lots of people don't know what the CSB does. And so, having those conversations, getting that information out there, and having people, within families to recognize some of the signs and symptoms of mental illness so that they can start to prevent those episodes from escalating, getting people help early on. You know, if we apply that same analogy of physical illness, usually if you catch that physical illness early on, you're able to make a greater impact and maybe not have it spread to so many other areas of the body. And it's the same thing with mental illness. If you catch it early on, you diagnose it and treat it, maybe it doesn't impact your relationships as much. Maybe it doesn't impact your workplace as much. Maybe you're able to, you know, function optimally in a quicker manner than if you have that to exacerbate. And so I think having people be aware of some of the signs like withdrawal, you know, people being excessively worried, people, you know, isolating themselves, things of that nature, just seeing those changes in behavior and looking for ways to support people prior to those situations escalating would be helpful. And of course, if people are medicated already, ensuring that, you know, we do what we can as a support system for a person to ensure that they take their medications. You know, sometimes people start to feel better and they say, you know, I don't need this anymore. And then, of course, over time, they learn that they really do need it. And so supporting people with that, making sure that they're keeping their appointments with their therapists, you know, case managers, you know, mentors for our youth. Those folks can recognize when there are changes in a person's behavior, you know, so not only are they providing a service, but they're also monitoring for any changes that that individual might exhibit, and that helps to intervene early on as well. And of course, I do agree with Sheriff Morgan, just continuing these types of conversations and, you know, of course, getting that information out into the community so that people can see, you know, your leaders are having these conversations. We know that this is a problem. We are working together to impact that change, but we need you to do your part. You know, be that person that recognizes those symptoms, be that person that says to that loved one, hey, you know, I will support you, I will go with you, you know, if you want to go to an appointment. You know, I will help you to hold yourself accountable to take your medications. There is nothing that you should be ashamed of here. You know, about 1 in 5 adults and about 1 in 6 children experiences some mental health issues, so that's pretty common. So, you know, I think just doing those kinds of things that we can do early on, anything that we can do preventatively will certainly be helpful. And it will help to kind of keep some of these crises that we're dealing with. And of course, as you all have talked about, the drain on those resources, we can probably avoid some of that if we can learn to approach these issues early on.
You know, Mayor, I would echo, I think that's phenomenal. Our microcosms of our different agencies that we have are made up of our community, our society. So I think it's important in our field 25, 30 years ago, you know, to talk to a department psychologist or if you see something that might affect you a certain way, it was kind of taboo. You didn't talk about that. So I think now a lot of it starts with leadership, that we focus that in our own organizations and it filters out into the community. That we have certain divisions in the police department, whether it's the SWAT team, the pressure that they're put under, forensic technicians who process some horrific crime scenes, to special victims who do a lot with kids and things that they see. They are mandated yearly to go to meet with the department psychologist, but to try to do it and make it more acceptable, myself and the assistant chiefs yearly, we make it known to the department, hey, we have we're meeting with the department psychologist to just talk, and there's some resistance at first, but what I find for most people that go through those sessions is, you know, I never was able to do that before. I was able to go somewhere and just talk about the crime scene or talk about this individual or this case, these things that weigh on me. So when those same officers go out into our communities and interact with someone who might be going through some of those same things, I think it helps to build a little bit of better relationship. So I think leadership and talking about the conversations, using that as a plus. You know, we always worry about our physical being, but our mental being affects how we interact with our community and our citizens. I just think it's a valued aspect that 25, 30 years ago in our profession, we don't want to talk about those things. I think it's important to have those conversations now.
I agree with Daphne. Mayor Price, I think we need to get back. So these are your services that are on the forefront of everything that you have here right now. I think we need to pull the hospitals in and have the conversation with them. Some of them are already involved, but we need to get them a little bit more involved. The unfortunate part is because of this area, probably more than 95% of everything falls on Riverside. But there are 2 other hospitals that are in the city of Newport News. Mm-hmm. So we need to pull everybody in and get those individuals together to begin having these fairs that Daphne was speaking of. And there's so many mental health agencies outside of CSB that folks don't even know about. So we need to bring them to the table as well and see what they can add or how can they help, because they only have so many employees, just like everybody at this panel. So there's only so much you can do with what services you do have. So, okay, if I'm tapped out at all of my services, how can I lean on Chief Drew to begin helping.
Well, I know that a lot of us feel that the pandemic is the elephant in the room with this spike in everything that we're seeing from crime to mental illness. Do we feel that this is something temporary, that maybe as the pandemic decreases we will see less of this, or is this the new norm for us? That mental health is something with the stress of life, with this, we've got not only the pandemic, the loss of life. Personally, I've lost 20 to 25 friends, peers, and relatives within the last 2 years. It's a strain. Sure. Is this something that we're now going to live with? We don't have the resources. People who have money can't get the products that they want. A lot of people out there wanting this new car and can't get it because, Is this something that you feel that you're seeing is going to stay with us, or you think it's just a bubble?
Well, I think, unfortunately, this might be a new normal. I think the effects of the pandemic are going to linger for some time. Folks trying to build themselves out of the different crises that they're going through. If that's evictions, if that's becoming homeless, if that's going through any mental health crisis that they may have, losing families, relatives, or friends. So I think it's going to take some time until we build back to normal.
As well as some of those issues that Quincy just mentioned that may not have brought themselves to the forefront, because pre-pandemic, I was working 80 plus hours a week. So guess what? I didn't really have a lot of extra time to realize that I did have a mental illness going on. So now that's been cut back. So now I'm at home a lot more. I'm dealing with my family a lot more. So now those issues that I had, however minor or major they may be, are starting to bring themselves to the forefront. So now is the time, as a family member, we need to come in and say, all right, I'm seeing something a little different in you. So let's, the help is out there. Let's see if we can get you evaluated and go from there. If nothing's wrong, then great, you're just stressed. We need to deal with that as well. But if we find something, then let's get you counseling, let's get you on medication, let's get you the resources that you need so that we don't have those incidents that law enforcement and ourselves have to respond to that we've seen in these last couple of weeks and months.
I agree with everything that's been said. I just would like to add to that. I think this is going to be somewhat of the new norm. And I think two things that we have not spoken about that's also affecting this is social media. We haven't spoken about the effects of social media as far as adding to the stress, particularly with the youth. They're placed in this position where, they're either comparing themselves to what they see on social media, or they're being bullied or pressured or all these other things on social media to, quote, what I refer to as live the lie, the lie of social media. And then, so social media. And then also, when you look from a political standpoint, what is spread on social media, and everybody gets into these silos, and there's an echo chamber, so they keep hearing the same thing, and they don't hear diverse voices. All of those things create a lot of stress, and that you see more and more people going to social media, and the venom that you see sometimes on social media. The other thing is the headwinds that we're facing from a economic and financial situation. They're arguing whether or not we're going to have a recession or not have a recession. The inflation, the folks can't get enough people to work. So if you're a private business or even the city for that matter, we can't get the number of people, the police departments, everybody's struggling. So that means if you're at work those 80 hours or 40, 50 hours, you have more stress because you're doing more with less because we don't have the right number of people to do the job. So it's a combination of all these things, I believe, and it's going to be a while before we get past these headwinds. And what we have to figure out as a community is how do we continue to reach out? How do we continue to respond in an empathetic way? And also, how do we continue to try to de-escalate and ensure that we are teaching the youth how to do conflict resolution? Because that's the crux of what we see in law enforcement and first responders when you go to a domestic. It really, conflict resolution is the start of most of the problems that we end up with.
I attended the high school graduations, and Sheriff is, man, he is just dead on. Every valedictorian that addressed their high school talked about, there were two things, as I listened to those speeches. One was the pressures of social media, and the other was how we lost 2 years of high school, right? And then they came back that senior year. And each valedictorian hit on that, how it affected them, how it affected the school, the time that they lost together, the football games, the basketball games, the relationships, and how so many have turned to social media and some of that pressure impacts them. So that may have something to do with some of the issues that we're seeing with our younger generation. But I thought it was impactful for me to hear high school students talking about those issues that the sheriff just laid out. Those are great points.
Yeah. Maybe that's something we can consider with the school board is having a panel come in and talk to the kids about conflict resolution. There's all, I mean, we know as adults because we've learned through time and through maturing, but you know, we have to get a lot of them to understand that there are other ways to solve things, you know, other than what's been obviously in the news here lately.
I will just say that we did partner with the school boards here within both Hampton and Newport News, and so we were able to offer outpatient therapy within the city of Newport News, and so they were actually recognized as in a national way for the work that they're doing in their schools, and so being able to have those therapists on site and also connect to other services, you know, for our youth is very helpful. And beneficial, but you know, obviously, I also agree with everything that's been said. I think that when we think about our youth, the other area that we can start to look at is to hopefully develop a pipeline for people who want to do this type of work. They've seen some of those impacts, and one of the things that we see with this generation is they are compassionate. You know, they feel for each other and they feel for society, and so being able to talk with them about doing work in the helping professions and, you know, maybe steer them in that direction, because you're right, not only are we short-staffed, but those needs are projected to increase, and that doesn't probably even take into consideration the impact that the pandemic has had. So being able to have those conversations, not only about what they can do to support their loved ones, but about, you know, them considering going into fields that can help to manage, you know, mental illness as well might be helpful.
Well, I want to thank you all today. I've learned a lot. I hope the community has learned a lot about the resources that are available to them. And I think one thing that because of the impact that has been mostly, as the statistics state, are affecting our youth more, I think it's something as a community we ought to reach out and mentor. We've talked more and more about the impact of one-on-one mentoring. And I think if everyone would commit to just take one child and spend a little bit more time, listen a little bit more, get them to put the devices down for a little while and do something else, I think it's going to help the whole community and help us all. So once again, I just want to thank you. I hope the community has learned the availability of the resources and see that we're all trying to work together to make sure that mental health is something that we address, recognize, and not be afraid to talk about. So once again, thank you for joining Price Points.